You hear it all the time, right? America's infrastructure is crumbling. Our roads, our bridges, our water systems, they're all falling apart because we've just stopped investing in them. It's a story we all kind of know by heart. But what if that story isn't the whole picture? Okay, so let's dig into this. This idea that the US has just failed to keep its infrastructure up to snuff, it's pretty much accepted as fact. It doesn't matter who you listen to, the message is the same. We've dropped the ball, and now everything's in a state of neglect and decay. And this is the core question we're going to explore, drawing on some really interesting analysis from the Manhattan Institute. What if our big infrastructure challenge isn't about the size of the budget at all, but about what we're actually trying to do with that money? So let's start with the biggest assumption in this whole debate, right? The idea that we've just turned off the money spigot. Well, check this out. According to the source material, if you look at our core infrastructure, we're talking transportation and water projects, our spending has held incredibly steady for the last 60 years. It's hovered right around 2.5% of our entire gross domestic product. Now, here's the crucial part of that. 2.5% of today's economy is a way bigger number than 2.5% of the economy back in, say, 1970. Since the whole economic pie has gotten so much larger, the actual dollar amount we spend on infrastructure in real terms has been going up and up consistently for decades. The data says the money is definitely there. All right, so if we're actually spending more than ever, what about the other half of the story? The idea that everything's in a state of total disrepair. Let's, actually look at the data. Okay, now this is fascinating. You'll often hear this kind of scary-sounding stat that about 7% of US bridges are structurally deficient. And yeah, that sounds bad. But what they don't always tell you is that that number has actually been cut by more than half just since the year 2000. The trend line is actually going in the right direction. We're getting better at this, not worse. And hey, it's not just the bridges. The share of our major roads that are rated in good condition, that's gone up. A wild 98% of our airport runways are in good shape. And maybe the most telling detail of all, for the first time ever recorded, we are now spending more of our infrastructure budget on maintenance and operations than on building brand new stuff. I mean, that really paints a picture of a system that is, for the most part, being kept up. So, if we're spending more money and things aren't exactly falling apart, then what is the real problem? Well, the source we're looking at argues it all comes down to a fundamental economic principle. It's called diminishing returns. It sounds complicated, but the idea is actually super simple. The first dollar you spend on something, it gives you the biggest bang for your buck. But every dollar you spend after that gives you a little bit less of a return, until eventually you're spending a whole lot of money for very, very little gain. And this is a perfect example. I mean, think about it. When we built the original interstate highway system, it was an absolute revolution. It supercharged the entire American economy, contributing to a third of all our productivity growth. But by the 1980s, adding more highways only kicked in about 7% to that growth. The massive, game-changing gains, they'd already been made. Or just look at this contrast right here. Back in the 1930s, the rural electrification project was an absolute game changer. It took farmers from just 10% electricity access to almost 100%. That's a different world. Today, we're spending massive amounts of public money on rural broadband to close a much smaller gap, going from maybe 75% access to 85%. Now, that's a good thing for sure, but it's not the transformative leap we saw in the past. That right there is diminishing returns in action. And oh boy, here's where it gets really, really stark. Public transit, buses and trains, it accounts for less than 2% of all the miles people travel in the United States. And yet, it gets nearly 20% of all government funding for passenger transportation. Just let that sink in. We are pouring a huge amount of money into a system that serves a tiny fraction of the actual need. That is a textbook sign of rapidly declining returns. So, the big question is why? Why do we keep funding projects that give us such a low return on our investment? Well, this is where the economic problem kind of morphs into a political one. When projects stop delivering huge, obvious benefits for everybody, the whole decision-making process starts to change. See, if a project isn't creating massive, widespread economic growth, the political incentive suddenly shifts. It becomes about rewarding specific, narrow interest groups. And there's this famous, or maybe I should say infamous, story from American transit history that illustrates this perfectly. So picture this. It's the 1930s and 40s, and you've got this group of corporate giants.
We're talking General Motors, Firestone, Standard Oil. They saw an opportunity. At the time, electric streetcars were how everybody got around in cities. But, streetcars don't use buses, or tires, or gasoline.
So their plan was brilliantly simple and kind of ruthless. They formed a front company, a holding company called National City Lines. They used it to buy up over 100 electric streetcar systems in cities all over the country, LA, Baltimore, you name it. And then they just systematically tore them down, ripping out the tracks and replacing them with GM buses that just happened to run on Firestone tires and use Standard Oil fuel.
And the consequences for this? Well, the companies were eventually convicted of conspiring to monopolize the sale of their products. And General Motors was fined, wait for it, $5,000. Their treasurer was fined $1. I mean, it was just a cost of doing business. A business decision that completely reshaped American cities for generations, all driven by corporate self-interest, not the public good.
Now, while that's a super dramatic example, the same basic dynamic is still with us today. You see it in things called earmarks. That's when a politician slips funding for a specific pet project in their district into a giant spending bill. The most famous example was the Bridge to Nowhere in Alaska, a nearly $500 million project with almost no real public benefit. These projects don't survive because they're good for the country, they survive because they're good for one politician's career.
And as projects become more about politics than productivity, their costs just explode. The budget isn't just for steel and concrete anymore. Suddenly, a slice of the pie goes to environmental consultants, another slice goes to satisfy various interest groups, and more gets eaten up by administrative overhead or rules like Buy America mandates, which can make things way more expensive. A lot of this isn't really about building better infrastructure, it's about building a political coalition to get the darn thing approved in the first place.
So if the real problem is diminishing returns and politics getting in the way, then just throwing more money at the same old system probably isn't the answer, right? The Manhattan Institute report we've been looking at suggests we need a fundamentally different approach. And this brings us to the report's central and, pretty provocative conclusion. The authors argue that, quote, the way for the government to build better is for it to build less. The idea here is that instead of just doing more, maybe the government should be doing less, but doing it far more strategically. So what does that actually look like in practice? Well, the proposal is basically to decentralize the whole process, end most of this top-down federal funding, and let states and local governments, the people who are actually closer to the real needs, make the decisions. This also means making more room for private investment and funding projects directly with user fees, like tolls. That way, the people who actually benefit the most from a new project are the ones who help pay for it. And that leaves us with a really challenging question. For decades, the knee-jerk answer to our infrastructure problems has always been build more. But if the real issues are diminishing returns and twisted political incentives, maybe the most innovative path forward is to build smarter, more selectively, and perhaps just maybe, to build a little bit less.